Imagine you spend 2 years working diligently on your Spanish. Then when you arrive in a Spanish-speaking country for the first time, you can't understand a word of what anyone says to you. Not only that, but when you speak Spanish, everyone laughs at you. Wild, uncontrollable fits of laughter. Okay, I made that part up. There were only a few people that laughed at me. Now, after that trip, I was dejected and I wanted to give up language learning, but I didn't give up. And in the end, I discovered 5 things that completely transformed my abilities that I wish I knew when I started. Now, at the very beginning of my Spanish journey, I bought 3 books, a grammar book, a short stories book, and a how to learn Spanish method-based book. Now, I studied these books like crazy, yet there was one thing that these books couldn't teach me. And it doesn't matter how well you know the vocabulary and the grammar, for speaking and listening, if you don't know the sounds of a language, people won't understand you and you won't understand them. So the thing I wish I knew at the start by studying the sounds of Spanish and never stop. When it comes to the sounds of languages, there are vowels, consonants, emphasis, rhythm, and tone. And for Spanish, the 2 most important things on this list are vowels and emphasis. And if I could go back in the weeks and months leading up to that trip, I would spend the majority of my time trying to master the vowels and emphasis of Spanish instead of trying to learn more words and grammar. Another major change I wish I had made much earlier is I signed up for a Spanish school after that trip. Now, this Spanish class met once a week and I ended up attending that school for several years. And it was more than just the structure that the school provided. It was working closely with the teachers. Prior to that trip, I was only learning on my own. I studied with books and podcasts. I didn't have anyone to guide me, to tell me what my strengths and my weaknesses were, or to tell me what to work on. And so the key thing I wish I knew is to seek the help of others. Now, you don't have to attend a formal Spanish school like I did. Anyone can help you, even other Spanish students at the same level as you. Now, the moment I let go of trying to learn everything on my own, my Spanish improved a lot and quickly. In fact, this period after my first trip to Spain was the time when I improved the most. And I mentioned the teachers made a big difference. In fact, my first teacher there, her name was Ileana, and she was from Mexico. And Ileana, if you're watching, I miss you. Probably not watching, but she changed everything. Not only did she teach me about Spanish, but she taught me about how to learn a language. She would start every class by saying, if you want me to explain something in English, I'll explain it in English. If you want me to explain it in Spanish, I'll explain it in Spanish. And if you want to ask a question, feel free to ask in either Spanish or English. It's up to you. No pressure. There were no rules in my classroom, she would say. And that stress, anxiety, and nerves can get in the way of the learning process, which is often what can happen in an immersion-based classroom. So Ileana taught us about the process of focusing on principles ahead of methods. Now, there's a lot of language learning advice that you'll hear, but really only a few things matter. And for Ileana, and now for me as a Spanish teacher as well, being relaxed when you are learning is one of the very few things you need to get right. And in an environment where you're forced to speak and forced to listen to something that you can't understand can cause anxiety, which shuts down those useful centers of the brain designed for learning. Now, all of that said, there are going to be times where you can't always control the environment. And the very first time I went to do a language exchange with a Spanish native, I was freaking out. I was so nervous I could barely move, let alone speak in another language. Now, often the deal in a language exchange is you speak for 30 minutes in English and then 30 minutes in Spanish. But that day I was so nervous I could barely get a word out. In the end, we spoke 99% English, and I would just simply ask him how to say short sentences. Now, I met up with that native once a week for several weeks, and in the end, my nerves basically went to zero. It didn't take long. So the thing I wish I knew was the importance of speaking early in your language learning journey, even before you feel you are ready. It is a big psychological hurdle to get over the fear of speaking, and the only way is to do it. But the good news is you can get over the nerves fairly quickly. And if you're extremely nervous about speaking, you've got to rip off that band-aid as early as possible. Now, several years later, I went back to Spain and I signed up for a language immersion program when my Spanish was a lot better. The program ran for 4 weeks and it was intense. 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. It was a lot. I tested my vocabulary and grammar before and a month after the trip, and it had barely changed. I was really disappointed. This experience retaught me a lesson that Ileana was trying to teach me, and my high school teachers had drummed into me several years earlier. You shouldn't just cram for exams. You should study all semester, they would say. And with Spanish, it's no different. For long-term retention of anything, you've got to prioritize consistency over intensity. And if I could go back, I would try to include more strategies that help me stay consistent instead of strategies to increase the intensity. So these are the 5 things that I wish I knew before I started to learn Spanish. Now, after you watch this video, if you want a recommendation for what to watch next, I would suggest the video on principles versus methods, where I go into a lot more detail on this idea. And this may be the most important thing that I learned about language learning and learning in general. I'll leave a link to that video here.